X-Oriente on this fine Sunday where we're having some technical issues, but we will get through them. I'm 50% of your host, Eric Diamond,
I'm the other 50%, Jason Van Dyke.
both past masters, both Masons,
Sure.
both here
Sure.
to provide light and entertainment and a lighthearted good time, right?
Light entertainment. I
Light
like that.
entertainment.
It's good stuff.
So last week we read the first two dialogues of Lessing's Dialogues for Freemasons. So if you haven't heard the last show, I would urge you to go ahead and take a look at that. What we did was we read it aloud and then kind of discussed a couple of them. And what's interesting about them is that they were written in 1776, 1777, and they're as pretty much as relevant today as I've ever seen any kind of Masonic writing. So,
Oh, definitely.
What's that?
I said, oh, definitely.
Yeah. So I thought it was kind of interesting. Hopefully, we'll be joined. We had a couple people in the feed before. Hopefully they'll make their way back. Okay. So, like I said, so these are written by a German philosopher. What's his name? Hang on a second. It's not Gottfried. It's like
No. Like that, though. Got something.
got something. Got
Yep.
milk.
Got God something.
Let's see.
Gott in Himmel.
Gott im Himmel. Let's see. Oh well. Anyway, his name is Got something. Let's say Gottfried. It's funny. Like this document, like it's so dense, but like it doesn't even like say his full name at the beginning.
No.
I think he
No.
would.
Yeah.
Just say Lessing, and everybody's supposed to know who Lessing is. But
Right.
right?
It's true.
Lessing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, Lessing. Him.
Oh, that guy. Yeah.
That guy.
I don't know. It's on our Facebook page.
Yeah.
That's what's important.
That is what is important, and it's also
Ask your local librarian.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so let me just get to. We're going to start with the third dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So when last we left off, so this is sort of the story of Ernst and Falk. Ernst is someone who's curious about Freemasonry, and Falk is we think he's a Freemason.
He says he is. Yeah.
Yeah, he says he is.
Yeah. And when last we left Ernst and Falk, which, by the way, have you noticed a slight undertone of homoeroticism?
No.
All right. I just bear with me. Bear with me because
looking for one, but
well, yeah, that's what the slight undertones are. So bear with me. But you see, as we go along, you'll start to find yourself going, "Hey, wait a minute."
Okay. I think maybe it might have been, more 18th century how men related to each other in Europe kind of thing. But
sure,
I'm going to keep an open
listen.
mind.
I've heard that before.
I'm going to keep an open
Listen, I've heard that before. I have friends who tell me that
So this is the third conversation. So in this
could be European.
Ernst has become a Freemason.
Correct.
And they're returning for the kind of the next dialogue. So it's kind of time has passed.
Correct.
I will be playing the part of Falk, and Jason, you'll be playing the part of Ernst.
Excellent. And remember, find your motivation as Falk. I'm going to do mine now.
Okay.
All day you've been avoiding me in the crowd, but I've tracked you down to your bedroom.
Do you have something important to say to me? I'm too tired for a mere chat.
You're ridiculing my curiosity.
Curiosity?
Can I just hold for 2 seconds here? How did you not see the homoeroticism as he tracks him down to his bedroom and then starts to berate him about curiosity? All right, we'll go back. Let's start from the beginning.
All right, you are in a mood today, my friend.
I'm just saying. All right, here we go.
All right.
All day long, you've been avoiding me in the crowd, but I've tracked you down to your bedroom.
Do you have something important to say to me? I'm too tired for a mere chat.
You're ridiculing my curiosity.
Curiosity?
Guess which you so artfully piqued this morning.
What were we talking about this morning?
The Freemasons.
Well, what about them? I hope I didn't give the secret away when I was tipsy on Piermont mineral water.
The secret, which you say no one can give away?
You know what? I think we read this one already.
No, you're right. I think we did. You're 100% right.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, we did.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
let's start with. Yeah, that's right. We did. Because the spark took, Ernst and Went became a Freemason. What he thus learned at first is the matter of a fourth and fifth conversation in which there is a parting of ways. So we're going to start with the fourth conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So in this one, Ernst has become a Freemason. Well, Ernst, here you are at last. I concluded my mineral cure ages ago.
And it agreed with you? I'm so glad.
What's the matter? I don't think I've ever heard "I'm glad" said so crossly.
I do feel cross, and very nearly with you.
Why?
You tempted me to do something silly. Look, give me your hand. What's that you say? You shrug your shoulders. That crowns it all.
I tempted you?
Perhaps without meaning to.
So I'm to blame?
The man of God tells the people of a land flowing with milk and honey, and you expect them not to yearn for it? Expect them not to murmur when he leads them, not to this promised land, but through barren wilderness?
Oh, come now. The damage surely could not be so great. Besides, I notice that you have been laboring among the graves of our forefathers.
Yes, but they were surrounded by smoke, not flames.
Then wait for the smoke to clear. Thereafter the flame will furnish light and heat.
The smoke will suffocate me before the flame gives me light, and others, I believe, better able to bear the smoke, will have the benefit of its warmth.
Are you referring to those who positively relish the sting of the smoke so long as it rises from some rich kitchen that isn't their own?
Then you admit you know these people.
I've heard of them.
In that case, what prompted you to lure me here by a fine show of things, the shallowness, ungrund, of which you knew very well?
Your irritation makes you quite unfair. I'm supposed to have talked about Freemasonry with you without giving you to understand in more than one way how pointless it would be for every decent man to become a Mason. Just not pointless, harmful.
Maybe you did.
I didn't tell you that the highest duties of Freemasonry can be fulfilled without bearing the name of Freemason.
I remember what you said, but you know perfectly well that when my fancy spreads its wings and takes off, there's no stopping it. I blame you only for showing such a luscious bait.
Bait that you soon got tired of struggling for. Besides, why did you tell me of your intentions?
Would you have tried to talk me out of them?
Certainly. Who'd put a dapper boy back in leading strings merely because he occasionally stumbles? I won't flatter you. You are far too along for me to hold you back. Even so, no exception could be made for you. All must enter by that way.
I would not be sorry to have entered upon it if I had higher expectations of the way remaining. Vain promises, nothing but vain promises.
Ah, so they're already holding out promises to you. Of what?
You know Scottish rites, the Scottish knight.
Ah, yes, of course. But what does the Scottish knight need consolation for?
I'd dearly like to know.
Your comrades, the other novices of the order, they don't know anything either?
They know plenty. They have such high hopes. One wants to make gold, the other wants to summon spirits, the third wants to revive the Order of the Knights Templar. You smile. Why do you smile?
What else can I do?
Show your disgust with these blockheads.
I would, except that there's one thing that reconciles me to them.
What?
In all these reveries, I detect a straining after reality, and all these wrong tracks nonetheless indicate where the true way leads.
Even the alchemy?
Yes. Whether gold can or can't be manufactured doesn't matter to me, but I am positive that reasonable men will want to be able to make it only on account of Freemasonry. And the one who should lay hold of the Philosopher's Stone would, that instant, become a Freemason. Isn't it remarkable that all the reports about alchemists, alleged or real, bear this out?
What about necromancers?
I'd say roughly the same of them. Spirits can't possibly listen to any human voice except that of a Freemason.
How can you say such things in so serious a tone?
By all that is sacred, my tone is no more serious than the things themselves are.
Can it be so? Where do you stand on the issue of the new Knights Templar, God willing?
Heavens, them.
I found you out. You can't come up with anything to say because Knights Templar did once exist, whereas there may never have been anyone who could succeed at making gold or summoning spirits. It's easier to tell how Freemasons deal with creatures of the imagination than how they deal with real beings.
I admit either or. There are only two alternatives.
If only one could be sure that at least one of them could be held true. Well, either these would be Templars.
Ernst, stop before you finish uttering yet another blasphemy. By my conscience, precisely these, are either securely on the right path or else so far from it that they should no longer even hope to ever reach it.
I'll just listen since asking for explanations.
Why don't you? For too long, petty secrets have been made the mystery.
How do you mean?
The mystery of Freemasonry is, as I told you before, something the Mason cannot utter, even supposing the possibility of his wanting to do so. Whereas little secrets are things perfectly sayable, which at certain times and in certain lands were concealed from envy, held back because of fear, kept covert for prudential reasons.
For instance?
For instance, this matter of the connection between the Knights Templar and the Freemasons. Perhaps there was a time when it was needful and good to take notice of it. Today, contrariwise, much harm may be done by keeping it a secret. Much better if it were openly admitted and the pertinent respect in which the Knights Templar were the Freemasons of their day determined.
May I hear of this point of likeness?
Read the history of the Knights Templar attentively. You are bound to make it out, which is why there was no need for you becoming a Freemason.
I wish I were among the books in my library. If I guess right, will you tell me?
You won't be needing such confirmation. But to return to either or, its decision turns on the very thing we're talking about. If all Masons who are today are big with the Knights Templar see and feel the true point of likeness, all is well within them. All is well with them and with the world. Blessings upon all their work and upon all they abstain from doing. But if they are blind and insensitive to it, if they let themselves be seduced by a mere homonym, if it were only the Freemason who works at the great temple, who reminded them of the Knights Templar, if they are merely infatuated with the red cross on their white mantle, if all they are after is a fat prebends for themselves and for their friends, well, then I pray that heaven grant us an ample supply of pity so that we'll be able to hold in our laughter.
I notice that you are capable of anger and bitterness after all.
Quite capable, unfortunately. Thank you for that remark. I'm cold again, like ice.
Which of the two conditions you described do you take to be that of our gentlemen?
The latter, I'm afraid. I wish I were mistaken, but how can I be, seeing that they've hit upon the crazy notion of reviving the Order of Knight Templar? That major respect in which the Templars were the Freemasons of their day no longer applies. Europe, at least, is way past it and no longer needs that sort of head start. So what are they after? Do they want to become the new absorbent sponge for the great to squeeze? But why am I asking you these questions, and what about about what people I'm asking? You didn't say these alchemical or necromancing or Knight Templar schemes are taken up by the older members of the order, by anyone who isn't a child, or else a man whom nothing stops from child abuse, did you? You couldn't have. Children grow up. Let them be. Suffice it that already said, in these children's toys I see weapons that grown men will someday wield with a sure hand.
Friend, what depresses me so isn't really this sort of childishness. Even without, like you, taking it as foreshadowing anything serious, I disregard it as a mere diversionary tactic. What bothers me is that I neither see nor hear about anything else, and no one is the least bit interested in the kind of thing you raised my hope for. No matter whom I talk to, never and nowhere do I meet with anything except blank silence when I try those themes.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about equality. That equality which you cited as a constitutional principle of the order. That equality which filled my soul with the unforeseen hope that I might breathe its air, at least among men who know how to get past social stratification without doing injury to their neighbor.
Well,
Does it still exist? Did it ever? Let an enlightened Jew ask for acceptance. A Jew? That will not do. Clearly, the candidate must be a Christian. What sort of Christian is indifferent? Regardless of a religious distinction, merely means without discriminating among the three officially tolerated denominations of the Holy Roman Empire. Is that your interpretation too, Falk?
no, I see it differently.
Suppose a crusty cobbler comes along, a man who, while working at his last, has sufficient leisure to think many a good thought. Let him ask to be accepted. They'll turn him down even if he be Jacob Boehme or Hans Sachs. A cobbler, they'll say? Why, clearly a cobbler. Or imagine that a faithful, seasoned, much tired manservant asked for acceptance. They'll say, that sort of person who is not at liberty to choose the colors of his own coat does not belong. We are such good company amongst ourselves.
Just how good is the company?
Nothing wrong with it at all, except that one gets tired of moving in nothing but the right social circles. Princes, dukes, lords, officers, counselors of every variety, merchants, artists. Sure, all these folks meet and greet each other at the lodges without distinction of rank. But at the bottom, they all belong to the same social rank, which is, unfortunately.
Things were different in my day. Still, I don't know. I can only guess. It's been too long since I was connected with any lodge. But don't you think there is a difference between not being admitted to a lodge for the time being and being excluded from Freemasonry?
How so?
Because of the analogy of that the lodge stands to Freemasonry as a church stands to faith. Nothing, absolutely nothing about the faith of the members can be inferred from the church's external prosperity. Quite the reverse. There is a kind of prosperity that would only be by miracle be compatible with genuine faith. Indeed, history shows us that the prosperity of the church and the faith of its members have always been at odds with each other, and one has always destroyed the other. And so I'm afraid that
What?
the goings-on at lodges today are, from what I'm told, quite beyond me. This keeping of accounts, accumulating of capital, these efforts to squeeze out the last percentage of profit, this desire to buy into partnerships, this going after royal and princely licenses, the using of princely authority and might to suppress brethren who observe rites different from the ones that some want to turn into the only genuine rites, these things must end in fiasco. I hope I'm a false prophet.
What's going to come of it all? The state no longer interferes much. Anyway, there are already too many Freemasons amongst those who make or maintain its laws for.
Good. Supposing that the Masons no longer need fear even the state, how, in your opinion, is this going to affect them? Doesn't it put them right back where they started? Doesn't it stop them from being what they mean to be? I'm not sure you quite understand me.
Keep talking.
Although, sure, nothing lasts forever. Perhaps Providence selected precisely this course of events to make an end of the present scheme of Freemasonry.
Scheme of Freemasonry?
Scheme, husk, guise.
I still don't follow.
Surely you don't suppose that Freemasonry has always played the Masonic part.
What are you talking about?
I'm asking you whether you hold that Freemasonry has always been called so. But look, it's going on supper time. My guests are arriving. You'll stay, won't you?
I did not intend to, but clearly I must, since a twofold nourishment is waiting for me.
Hush, none of that at the table.
All right.
All right, so that's the fourth conversation. My reaction to it is, yikes.
Yeah, totally, right? But it's really interesting because, again, it's completely relevant to our time. It is a new Mason who has now been initiated, and once he's initiated, like a lot of people, their expectations are not met, right?
Right.
So it's not that different from what everybody deals with.
No, I think it's remarkably prescient, right? But it's kind of what I was more thinking about Falk. Like, Falk seems to be very disillusioned himself, and
well, yeah, totally.
He's basically dismissing all of the organized parts of Freemasonry. I have to confess, I kind of do the same thing a little bit, right?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
In railing
It's very
against,
Protestant,
yeah,
right?
yes,
But it's really interesting.
yeah. What I
Yeah.
think is interesting about it is that, this was at the time when those additional degrees were starting to circulate, right?
Sure.
And
Hmm.
so they became super fashionable, especially among the wealthy and you know, the, like you had Cagliostro kind of running around Europe doing his
Yep.
Memphis Mizraim, right? And stuff like
Hmm.
that. And so I don't know. I wonder, like it sounds like Lessing was very uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Very disillusioned with that. Like I think it seems to me that the direction he was going was the direction that the French went. Like he's kind of sounding a little like a a Grand Orient guy, right?
Sure.
In the sense that he's looking for Masonry to be much more activist and much less esoteric and philosophical.
Right.
It seems like
Yeah.
Falk is a product
Much
of the
much
Enlightenment.
more. Yeah. Yeah. And Ernst is a hard realist.
Yeah, I would say that.
Yeah. Sure. I agree with that. All right.
Do you think his
Okay.
picking on the Knights Templar was
uh,
anything? I mean, not being one, I can't really comment on it, but
I'm not. I'm not one either, so I wouldn't know.
oh, okay.
I don't know. I really don't. Um, but I don't know. I think it goes to it goes to like it's almost like this thing is like written for you, right? Because it goes back to that Knights Templar thing where it's like, yeah, that's a really great organization if you happen to be Christian and of the right denomination, right? Like come on. Um, what's Masonic about keeping people out?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know. Like, I think what's much more interesting about his criticism is that it kind of focuses on the wrong thing. It makes the Masons look backward as a way of getting sort of social respect, and that's what I found
Sure.
really interesting in it. Yes, the lack of ecumenicalism, I did pick up on that, but um,
Hmm.
uh, my feeling about it is kind of just that I feel like and we've talked about this. This is no secret
Hmm.
that
Right.
the dominance of the appendant bodies without any real purpose, other
Yeah.
than I tack I have an eye foundation for this one, I have a hospital for that one, I have a nurses
Sure.
charity for this one. Aside from that, there's really very little to differentiate between the two, and all they do is like suck the energy out of Masonry. What's interesting is that here it is, 1776, and already these guys are having the same kinds of concerns.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
Yeah. It's interesting.
and they didn't have like Shriners International and stuff like that. So I think that that's kind of an interesting build. Okay,
Yeah,
so
I agree. I agree.
on to our last conversation.
Yeah. They've left at last. What babblers. They seem to have not noticed. Perhaps you didn't want to? That the one with the wart on his chin, who cares about his name, is a Mason. He kept knocking.
Yes, I heard him. From his harangues, I gathered, as you may not have, that he's one of those who, in Europe, fight for the Americans. Ooh, single
That's the
title.
least of his faults.
He fancies that the American Congress is a Masonic lodge and that the Freemasons are there at last, establishing their realm by force of arms.
That kind of dreamer exists as well.
Unavoidably.
From what do you conclude that he is given to such notions?
From a trait which will eventually become more conspicuous to you as well.
God, if I knew that I had been so much deceived in the Freemasons.
Don't fret. The Freemason calmly waits for the sun to rise and leaves the lights on in the meantime, allowing them to shine for as long as they want to and are able. It's not his way to snuff the candles and when they are extinguished suddenly to realize that the stubs must be relit or other light provided.
That's how I see it. What costs blood is sure not to deserve it.
Excellent. Now ask what you will. I must answer you.
Then there will be no end of questions.
Only you don't know where to start?
Did I or didn't I understand you just before we were interrupted? Weren't you or weren't you contradicting yourself? Because when in an earlier conversation you said that Freemasonry has always existed, I understood you to mean that it is not only its essence, but also its present organization date back to hoary ages.
As though both were the same case. The essence of Freemasonry is as old as civil society. The two could not arise except together, if indeed civil society isn't merely an offshoot of Freemasonry. The flame at the focus is still due to the sun.
It's how it dimly looks to me, too.
But whether their relation be that of mother and daughter or of sisters, the fate of either has always been affected by that of the other. Whenever the condition of civil society anywhere, such too is the condition of Freemasonry, and vice versa. The most reliable indication of the soundness and strength of a state has always been whether or not it permitted Freemasonry to flourish by its side, just as to this day an unmistakable sign of a state's weakness and timidity if it won't openly tolerate what it must, willingly or not, tolerate covertly.
To wit, Freemasonry?
Of course, because at the bottom it does not depend on external ties which so easily degenerate into civil ordinances. It depends rather on the community feeling of minds attuned to one another.
And who would dare to legislate about that?
Which doesn't take away from the fact that Freemasonry has always and everywhere been obliged to accommodate itself to the format of civil society, which has always been the stronger association. As many were the forms of civil society, so necessarily were the forms of Freemasonry, each of these, of course, receiving a new name. How could you have imagined that the name was older than the ruling political way of thought for which it was tailor-made?
What is that ruling way of thought?
I leave the question to your own investigations. Suffice it to say that the name Freemasonry did not become applied to members of our secret brotherhood until the beginning of this century. The name doesn't reliably occur in any printed work of earlier date, and I dare anyone to show me an older document, even in handwritten form.
You were talking about the German version of the name, aren't you?
No, I mean the original English name Freemason, along with all subsequent translations of it.
You can't be serious. Reconsider. The name occurs in no printed work prior to this century? None?
None.
Yet I have myself.
Some of the dust still hasn't settled. Got in your eyes too?
But what about the passage in
Londonopolis? That's what you mean, isn't it? Dust.
What about the Acts of Parliament under Henry VI?
Dust.
And the great privileges granted to the Gothenburg lodges by Charles XI, King of Sweden?
Dust.
And Locke.
Which Locke do you have in mind?
The philosopher. His letters to the Earl of Pembroke. He notes of a hearing written in Henry VI's own hand.
That must be an entirely new find of which I haven't heard. But no, Henry V again, or Henry VI again? Dust. Nothing but dust.
I can't be.
Why would you call these word twistings and sham documents?
How could they have gotten away with such deception with all of the world's eyes upon them?
Easy. There are never enough sensible people around for those few to contradict every piece of nonsense from its inception. Enough that if they don't let it persist. Obviously, not to have nonsense foisted on the public at all would be better, because precisely the most despicable nonsense can, being so despicable that nobody bothers to fight it, acquire an air of the serious and sacred in the course of time. And so, after an interval of 1,000 years, people will say, would this have been allowed to circulate in written form if it weren't true? No. No one contradicted these trustworthy men back then. Do you want to contradict them now?
Oh, history, history. What are you?
Anderson's callow rhapsody, in which the history of the building arts is given out as the history of the Masonic order, is not so bad. Perhaps it was good for something in its day. Besides, the fraud was easily detected. But people should continue to build on such marshy ground that they should maintain in print what they'd be ashamed to say viva voce to a serious man, that to keep a joke going which should have been dropped long ago, that even they resort to forgery, a forgery for which they would have been put in the stocks if some minor civil matter had been at issue.
But mightn't have more than just a play on words be involved? What if it were true that from of the old secret of the order has chiefly been preserved by the harmonious craft?
If it were true.
Mustn't it be? Why else should the order borrow its symbols precisely from this craft? Why not from some other?
It's an appealing question.
There must be an explanation of the fact.
There is.
But not the one I offered?
No, an entirely different one.
All right, am I supposed to guess or are you going to tell me?
If a while back you had asked me quite another question, one that I was waiting for, you'd easily come up with the answer now.
What question were you waiting for me to ask?
When I told you that Freemasonry has not always borne that name, wasn't it only natural immediately to ask,
What other name has it had? Quite. So I ask the question now.
you want to know what Freemasonry was called before Freemasonry? I answer, Masony.
Sure, the English name.
No, the English name was not Masonry, but Masony, deriving not from mason, worker in stone, but from mese, tablet or table.
Mese, meaning table. In what language?
In the language of the Anglo-Saxons, but in that of the Goths and Franks as well, so the word is German originally. Even today, a number of compound words form from it that are in common use, or until recently, for instance, mascopi, masledig, magnosa. In Luther's day, masone was still familiar, but its good meaning became altered to a worse.
I know nothing about either a good or a bad sense of the word.
Still, you don't know the custom of our forefathers to deliberate about the most important matters while at a table. Mese refers to a table and maisonne to a private supper party. How a private supper party turned into a drinking party, which is how Agricola understands the word, is easily seen.
Is that what happened to the word lodge?
But earlier, before some Masonies degenerated in this way and lost their good repute, they were held in the highest regard. Not a court in Germany, large or small, but had one. To this fact, the old songbooks and histories testify. Masonies had their own building, often adjoining to or near the castles and palaces of the ruling prince. The building's name, so often erroneously attributed, derived from this connection. What more need I say of the celebrity of these supper clubs, other than the Society of the Round Table was the first and oldest from which all the others spring?
The Round Table? That goes back to quite a fabulous antiquity.
The story of King Arthur may be a fable, but the Round Table is not.
Wasn't Arthur the one who established it?
By no means, not even according to the fable. Arthur or his father took it over from the Anglo-Saxons, as the name Masony suggests. And isn't it more than likely that the Anglo-Saxons brought on only such customs to England as they also left behind in their original fatherland? Besides, other Germanic nations of the day had the same penchant for forming smaller, more intimate groups in the context of the greater civil society.
What are you trying to tell me?
Hang on 1 second. All that I now say in brief, and perhaps without the necessary qualifications, I promise to document next time when we're both in the city and have access to my books. For the present, hear me out as you would the first rumor of some great event. Let curiosity be piqued rather than satisfied.
Where did you leave off?
Masony, then, was a German custom which the Saxons transplanted to England. There is some disagreement among scholars on the question of who the Thanes of Masony were. Perhaps they were its nobles. At any rate, Masony struck such a deep root in the new soil that it hung on under all changes of regime and every once in a while rose to flourishing condition. The 12th and 13th century Masonies of the Knights Templar became especially famous. It was such a Templar Masony which, despite the dissolution of the order, maintained itself in London until the end of the 17th century. And here begins the period which, though undocumented in written history, is nevertheless attested to by a tradition so carefully preserved and marked by so many signs of trustworthiness that the tradition may substitute for the written history that is lacking.
What stands in the way of turning this tradition at last into a history by means of documentary proof?
What stands in the way? Nothing. There is much to be said for it. At least I feel justified. even obligated to disclose this history to you and to all who are in your position.
Well, then, out with it. I'm all ears.
As I said, this Templar Masonry was still in existence in London at the end of the 17th century. Its meeting house stood in the vicinity of St. Paul's Cathedral, which was then undergoing alteration. The master builder of this second church of the entire world was
Christopher Wren.
You have just named the creator of the whole of modern Freemasonry.
Him?
Briefly put, Wren, the master builder of the Cathedral of St. Paul's, in the vicinity of which an extremely ancient masonry used to assemble since the time immemorial, was a member of this masonry, and during the 30 years of St. Paul's reconstruction, he visited it regularly.
I begin to smell a misunderstanding.
What else? The true meaning of the word masonry has been forgotten by the English people, got lost. A masonry, hard by so important a building venture, so regularly frequented by the master builder, what else could it be than a masonry, a society of men skilled in the art of architecture, with whom Wren consulted about architectural problems?
A perfectly natural inference.
All London was interested in getting progress reports on the construction of such a church. To get first-hand information, all who deemed themselves to possess any building expertise would clamor for admission to the supposed masonry and ask in vain. Finally, you know Christopher Wren, what sort of man he was, how inventive and energetic. Wren had earlier participated in the projecting of a scientific society that would make speculative truths more directly efficacious in establishing the public good and in making civic life more commodious. Then it occurred to him that a society that rose from the activities of daily life to speculation would be a fitting counterpart to it. There, he thought, men would investigate what truths are useful. Here, what useful things are true. What if I can make some of the principles of Masonry exoteric? What if I hide the things that cannot be made exoteric under the hieroglyphs and symbols of the building craft? Why not enlarge what people now take to be the sense of the word masonry so that it becomes a Freemasonry in which a larger number can participate? Thus thought Wren, and thereby Freemasonry sprang into being. How does that strike you?
I'm dazzled.
Do you see a little light now?
A little? Too much all of a sudden.
I beg you, friend. Now you do understand.
I beg you, friend, no more. Don't you have urgent business in the city?
Is this where you want me to be?
Want? After you promised to?
Well then, there are a number of matters that require my attention there. Let me reiterate, relying on memory, I may have spoken too vaguely to satisfy you, but among my books you will see and seize hold. The sun is going down, you must be off to the city. Farewell.
One sun is setting, another rising. Farewell.
And this ends the dialogues.
Yeah.
I don't know what to make of this one. That whole masonry thing.
Yeah.
It just
never heard that before.
It's me neither, and it just seems really forced and kind of weird.
Yeah. I kind of get it a little bit, maybe. I think that it's really tempting, knowing what was going on in London in the late 1600s, politically as well as societally. Mm-hmm. I think it's natural to wonder about what Masonry was at that time. We know it existed there. There's very little written about it, but we know it was there, right? So what is the Regis manuscript is what? 15 what?
The Regis manuscript is like 1200
yeah.
something.
I'm sorry, is it 12? No, it's 15. Isn't it?
No.
What am I thinking of? There's something that's 1500s. I thought that was No, I think that's the Regis, and I thought that was like 15.
I don't know, man. Maybe we need to do some history work on this.
We clearly do. I thought it was like the 1500s. At any rate, the important thing is that it kind of goes dead, and then the first mention of it ever of Masonry as a thing mm-hmm. at all mm-hmm. pops up again, just outside of London, in Elias Ashmole's diary. And Ashmole was he was a professor at Oxford, And that was kind of a weird thing at those times. It really would have meant that he would have been part of the brand spanking new middle class. He wasn't a noble, but he wasn't poor. He wasn't a serf. He was well educated, and had a little bit of money, and so could spend his time thinking about big cosmic issues. Whereas, a normal person living in London at the time would have been literally just scraping by, trying to live every day. So he was a little bit of a different kind of a guy. At any rate, he at the time, educated men like himself were very committed diarists. Even if it was just a couple sentences a day, just to say what he did that day, and he kept them all for years and years and years and years. His contemporary Samuel Pepys is the most famous diarist of the time, and Pepys would have been a very close friend of Elias Ashmole. But Ashmole writes in his journal, "Tonight I was made a Freemason." That's it. That's all he writes, right. and then it goes away, right? And that's in something like 1680, and then we don't hear anything again until 1717. So it's natural, I think, going back to these dialogues, it's natural to try and make more sense of it, and to make more sense of it with these kings of thought, who were living in England at the time, right after the Great Fire in 1666, and literally rebuilding a giant city, a megapolis, really, that had burnt down. And it was a huge job, and it took the smartest men in all of Europe to do it. And they were lucky. They had Christopher Wren, who was really that smart. He really was incredible. And Wren, along with a few others, like who am I thinking of? The famous physicist, scientist. Come on now.
Physical scientist Newton.
Yeah.
Isaac Newton.
Yeah. So Isaac Newton we know for a fact, was friends with Wren, or at least was friendly, as they were both part of the Royal Society. The Royal Society boasted huge names in thought. Now, they were mostly interested in physical science. They were just starting to get into the scientific method at the time, and were trying to derive physical truths, right? Mm-hmm. But it makes sense that at the same time, they'd want somewhere where they could balance that search for physical truths with with some sort of a philosophical truth, and a place where they could talk about really big ideas. After they were done, vivisecting a dog to see its heart work. You know what I'm saying? Those are very physical. Like, I want to see how this works. I want to pull it apart. They're engineering type things. Whereas, if you're in the coffee shop, if you're talking about philosophy and things like that, I think it's tempting to think that those guys really got into that as well, as their physical pursuits. And over and above all that, I think this makes actually a roundabout argument, is saying that that Wren thought that his conversations were getting too heady, and that not everybody was following what he was trying to talk about. Mm-hmm. And so, as a means of explanation, and as a means of giving an example that everybody could follow along with what he was trying to say, he used the building arts, because everybody would have been familiar with the building arts. They were literally rebuilding London at the time, right? So everybody would have had a passing idea of what created a building and things like that. And so I think it's a universal language that they all would have spoke. So maybe that's it, right? Now, before you go on, okay, that's a devil's advocate explanation. I don't know if I believe it, but I tried really hard.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah.
I think that So if I could be the Falk of speculation at this moment,
Sure.
I think the reason, so Ernst and Falk asks a really good question, which is, why did they pick this? I mean, why isn't it the order of plumbers or the order of,
Sure.
what was it about building arts that captured the imagination and took this thing you know, into builders,
I think because the building itself is it's big, grand, and I think again that a wide audience understands its language.
So I disagree. I think the reason
Okay.
that they chose the building arts was because these are guys who were starting to embark on truth that was independent of what the authorities were telling them.
Sure, and they're
Right.
starting from scratch, right?
Well, they're starting, they're starting from a grounding in like the Renaissance, right? And they
Mhm.
are, but what the thing about building, right, is that you can believe what you want to believe about a building. It's kind of like that Monty Python sketch about architects and Freemasons, right? You can believe what you want to believe about a building, but if you don't get
Correct.
it right, it falls down,
Correct.
right? So
No, absolutely.
there's of all the arts, right,
Mhm.
that are there.
Right.
This one, it doesn't matter what the Pope tells you. If the Pope tells you to
That's
put a
right.
buttress in the wrong place, your church
Yeah.
is going to fall down on top of your head.
Right.
So it's the one place where sort of truth trumps
Belief.
belief,
Sure.
right? And so and the other thing too is that if you look at where the technology of the time was expressed, it was expressed in buildings,
Correct.
in the
Absolutely
grandeur of
correct.
them, right?
Absolutely correct.
And so I think it makes a lot of sense because those are the I don't know, those are the metaphors that I think captures the imagination much more so than something like navigation or an astrolabe or something like that, because
Absolutely.
you don't see that, right?
No.
Columbus goes
No.
on his ship and he sails out into the ocean, and you just don't hear from him for a few years,
Right.
and then he comes back with ships laden full of
Sure.
spices and
Right.
gold.
Right.
You know he succeeded, but
Sure.
but when you see a church being built, you see it go up, and you see it, and so I think that's
Well,
where.
and again, it's a universal language that everyone would have understood, because when especially when when that metaphor is a church, right? Because in those times, a cathedral would have been a big deal, and it was very common for them to be built, but it took hundreds of years. It took generations to build a cathedral, and it took generations because they had to do it right, and they had to do it steady, and it had to have the right foundation
Mhm.
for this thing to emerge from it. And I think that everybody gets that metaphor when you apply it to human philosophy, philosophy of thought, and sort of a interpersonal politics, I guess, right? And that's that. Just saying, hey, you have to have a good foundation of goodness, of just being a good person on a daily basis. That's your foundation. That's where you start. And everything builds upon that because it needs to be solid. Everybody would have gone, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I get that. Completely understand where you're coming from with that. I mean, even the lowliest peasant would have gotten that because they can see it. They see it actually happening in their communities. So, yeah, I mean, I just think it is a good universal language.
Yeah, I also caught the sick burn about the against the Americans.
That was great, wasn't it?
Right, those hotheads.
Well, I think it's also really funny because it's like, yeah, their government is not Masonic. Like, sure, there's a bunch of Masons that are about it, but it's not a Masonic government. That's ridiculous.
Well, it is unless you're sitting in Europe, right?
Right.
If you're sitting in Europe and you're looking
Right.
and you're a Freemason, right, and you've been indoctrinated with sort of Masonic ideals,
right?
You're looking over across the pond, right? What you're seeing is a bunch of guys who are like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that, the unalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they're going, they've got to be Mason. Like it's just, I think, you know what I mean? Like,
right, sure.
I think from a European perspective,
sure. It's a lot of salon talk. Right.
One man, one vote. What kind of craziness is that?
Right.
No king.
I think it's hilarious because it's literally what all of the royals in Europe had thought all along, which was, you give them the written word too long, they get uppity. Look what happens. Right? I told you, right? Yeah, totally. It totally is.
But I thought it was funny, like the way they're kind of rolling their eyes, like, oh, those
Americans. I do too. Yeah. Oh, the Americans. They think they're so wonderful. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Abe Metz on social media, he says, to our thing about using the building arts as a metaphor, he says they could have done it with baking too. You could use the rolling pin and spatula and working tools too. Now, that's true.
Listen, fine, but it's not nearly as glamorous and glorious, right? Because when's the last time you heard someone, write a poem or an ode to a really well-baked loaf of bread or a great cake? Do you know what I'm saying? Never. But the cathedrals, Notre Dame has poetry all over the place. It's an icon, and it has been for centuries.
Yeah. And I would go so far as to say, I think the reason that you don't do baking is because when, as good as your art could be, right? Let's say that you bake the quintessential, the perfect loaf of bread. This is the most beautiful loaf of bread that anyone's ever seen.
The platonic ideal of bread.
The platonic ideal of bread. In 4 days, you're going to have a mess, right?
Bingo. I was going to say the same thing.
Whereas a cathedral lasts...
Right. Lasts forever.
Yeah.
Right? Or at least centuries. Yeah. Generations and generations. It takes generations and generations to build.
You can go meander around the Hagia Sophia or the Pantheon in Rome, and it's still, it's still kicking.
Right. So I think, but all that Roman bread, kind of gross.
That's right. So I think that there's kind of a like a built-in I don't know prejudice is the word, but there's a built-in preference for something that is eternal.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll buy that.
And really only two things are eternal, right? Buildings and religion.
Sure.
I mean, I'm trying to think of anything back then.
Yeah, right. Sure. That was passed down.
Look at a group of people and say that's a permanent thing.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you don't
buildings, especially, buildings, particularly cathedrals, which is really what we talk about in our building, in our ritual, our metaphor of building is really cathedral building, and absolutely, that's good. That's going to last the ages.
So let me ask you a question. Thinking of the dialogues as a whole, what was most striking? What did you come away with in that?
On a whole?
Yeah.
I think mostly I came away with a real appreciation for how some problems remain the same. It's really interesting. I mean, we just got done 2 seconds ago talking about how, building lasts forever. Well, so do some questions. So do some problems. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what I kind of take away from this is that we're not the first ones to struggle with this. And I think strangely, it's reassuring to me.
Yeah. I think that was the biggest thing that I came away with was that if they were struggling with this back in 1776, and remember, Masonry back then was still pretty small.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, it was.
They didn't have big buildings and houses of the temple and all that stuff. I mean, that happened much, much later. So Masonry is still a pretty small thing, and they're worried about the direction that it's going in. They're worried, are we getting too focused on this crazy
The
esoteric
esoterics.
stuff like
Yeah. Right.
alchemy, and I'm like, wow, really?
Which is hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love it.
Right. And they were concerned about the same things back then.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, you're right. It is rather reassuring
Hmm.
that we still struggle with the same things. The other thing that that struck me is that we always like to say, well, in my day, right, the grumpy past master refrain. Well, in my day,
Sure.
things were better, right?
Right. Yeah.
And they're kind of doing the same thing in these dialogues, right? So
Oh, yeah.
the thing about the dialogues from a Masonic perspective is that there's a lot of human nature in it,
Yeah.
right? A
Yeah,
lot
I
of
agree with that.
like Ernst is this starry-eyed, ideologue
Hmm.
when he comes to Masonry, and then he
Hmm.
gets in it and he finds that it's all like spaghetti dinners and alchemy, and you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
he's like, we're not talking about any of this noble stuff that we were talking about that made me interested to become a. Where's the secret knowledge? You know?
Right. Yeah. Right. Right.
And so
Yeah. I agree with that.
I
I
found
totally
that,
agree with that.
yeah, I found that really interesting. And that, it's like, it's funny, but when you read some of the early works of Masonry, and just to kind of set context, Lessing himself was kind of a disillusioned Freemason. I think he kind of joined the fraternity uh, uh, very uh, very enthusiastically, and I think he kind of became disillusioned with it. What's
Sure.
interesting is that these dialogues are dedicated to his friend, the Duke of Brunswick.
Hmm.
And I don't know. I know that the Duke of Brunswick was himself a Mason. What I don't
Okay.
know is why that's significant, and that's
Hmm.
something I want to do a little bit of historical research on.
Hmm.
Is was Brunswick one of these? Like, was this a scold to Brunswick in some way, or was this
Sure.
expressing
Right.
something that Brunswick was sort of saying privately but couldn't say
Sure.
publicly?
Sure. Was Brunswick, or was Lessig at one time Ernst?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Yeah.
So I want to find out a little
Okay.
bit more
Yeah. Yeah.
more about that, uh, and I feel like it's interesting because of the way in which, like when you read stuff from back in the founding of the fraternity, right? It's all like, it reads all much of it like Anderson constitutions, right?
Hmm.
They're either manuscripts and rituals, right, or they are these sort of treaties that wax poetic about how Adam was himself the first Freemason, and Moses was
Right. Yeah.
knew the secret word, and blah blah blah. It just seems like very aggrandizing, and I understand why, right? That's a normal part of the formation of groups. This was the first thing that I've read from that time period that
Hmm.
was internally critical. Like, there have been things that I've read that have been
Yeah.
critical of Masons
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the outside of
Sure.
Masonry, but this is the
Yeah.
first one
Yeah.
that I've read from the inside
Yeah.
that was critical.
Yeah.
And I
I'll
think
buy that.
that's kind of interesting.
I'll buy that, and I agree with you. I think that a lot of the founding documents and things like that. You're right. They wax. It's just their marketing documents, right?
Right.
And the thing is that even then, I think the savvy reader would have read that and gone, oh, Jesus, okay, yeah, yada 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 yada. Get to the point. Where are we going with this? What are we doing? Why are we doing this?
Right.
You know, but it was there as a show. They had to dress it up a little bit before. There has to be some foreplay, right? And so, yeah, I agree. And this is I didn't think about it until just when you said it. This is the first thing that I've ever read that's that early, that's internally critical, and it is kind of surprising.
Mhm.
Hmm. It's a lot to think about, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting is that at this point in time, I mean, wasn't like the whole struggle between the ancients and the moderns like in full swing?
Yeah, it would have
So
been.
there's doesn't like, my question where does Lessing fit into that, if at all? Like, is this just a complete? Is this like the beginning of the break between continental Freemasonry and British Freemasonry?
Sure. Yeah. Well, this also would have been. I think this is right around the time of the Illuminati problem, and
Yeah.
he would have had a front row seat for that, where he was.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Well, it was founded in 1776, I think,
yeah, it was. And
inspired by
so,
the.
yeah, and I think that it would be interesting to find out what Lessing thought of that. You know,
Yeah.
um, because I mean, this criticism is pretty scathing. Can you imagine what he would have thought about the Illuminati? um, and Adam Weishaupt. I think I would love to hear what he had to say about that. But yeah, the time period, the context in which this was written is really interesting. It's really interesting. Um, yeah,
Yeah. So we're gonna, we've posted
sure.
this in the show notes. We'll post it again in
Yeah.
this episode's version of the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
I urge you to take a look at it and read it for yourself.
Right.
Let us
Mm-hmm.
know what you think. We'd
Mm-hmm.
love to hear from you at xoriente@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on our Facebook page. And I guess this is the part of the show where we thank our executive producers. Without your help, this show doesn't happen. And what else? Anything else? If you'd like to become an executive producer,
Yeah.
go to our
Mm-hmm.
Patreon page. It's patreon.com/xoriente. And make a pledge, and you'll be helping create thought-provoking Masonic programming every week or so.
Yeah. I would like to point out, just as a postscript to all of this, very little time and very little money was used in the furtherance of our theater skills.
Right.
And I think
We'll
that's
not
obvious.
be quitting our day jobs
No, not at all.
anytime soon.
No.
But thank you to Abe Metz and, of course, Mike Hambricht and Federico Poggi from Argentina. Came back from La Plata. So thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.
We normally try to do the show Sunday nights. We did it a little bit earlier today because of
the Packers are playing tonight.
The Packers
go Pack go
tonight. And sadly, Jason has a disease, which the only cure is more cowbell and more Packers.
More Packers, baby.
And so we'll probably get back to a little bit of a regular schedule once the Packers either drop off the map or football season is over.
Don't say that.
But usually we try to do the show Sunday nights, usually at around 7. We went a little bit earlier today, but when we go earlier, we'll make an announcement on the Facebook page. So check back with us for more programming notes. Until then, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care, Viet Fox.
Good night, everybody.